Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at als vierzig, nach, Ostern, which translates to 4 days has passed since Christ arose. This is a longer chorale in comparison to the ones that we've been looking at recently. Relatively straightforward harmonically, but it does have some interesting twists and turns here and there that we're going to talk about when we get there. So we're just going to hop right into the analysis. 1 sharp in the key signature. We're in 3/4 time. We start on E minor. We end on B major. Kind of interesting that we do not cadence in an authentic fashion at the end of the chorale, but I think the overall tonality of this chorale is E minor. After our first E minor chord, we have G, G, B, and E. That's another E minor chord, but it's in first inversion, so we'll change the figured bass to reflect that. And then we go right back to root position, E, G, B, and E. So again, no need to reiterate the Roman numeral, just change the figured bass. We then have D sharp, F sharp, F sharp, and B. That is B major over D sharp, which is our 5 chord in first inversion. And then we get another sort of similar thing here where we take the chord and just re-invert it. B, D sharp, F sharp, and B. That's just taking the chord and putting it in root position. We then resolve to our tonic, E, E, G, and B. And then we go to C sharp, E, G, and A. This is A7 over C sharp, or in E minor terms, that is 4/6/5, some melodic minor going on in the bass here. And then we have D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, which is B major over D sharp again. That's a 5/6 chord. And that resolves exactly where we would expect E minor, E, B, E, and G, our tonic triad, with a passing tone in the melody. We then have an interesting chord here. We have D natural, B, F sharp, and B. This is a minor dominant, B minor over D, which is 5/6. Then we get some descending harmony here. We have C, C, E, and A. That is A minor over C, which is 4/6. 4/6, so raised scale degrees going up, lowered scale degrees or natural scale degrees going down. So we get both sides of the harmony here, the major and the minor. This B is a neighbor tone, this E is like an appoggiatura, I guess, and also this G is also like an appoggiatura. It spells out an E minor chord, but we have this A here as well. So we don't really have the, sorry if you can hear that in the background, it's a little distracting. It's Fleet Week in my city, so there might be airplanes flying by. But yeah, we have like the makings of an E minor triad here, but we have this A held over in the melody, so it's not really an analyzable chord using Bach's vocabulary. We then have C, D sharp, F sharp, and A, which is D sharp fully diminished over C, so 4 going to 7/4/2, that's a good sign. And because we end on a half cadence here, which is kind of interesting because we have the tonic of the chord in the melody, that's typically not something you would find in a half cadence in Bach. We have these 2 E's here, and this harkens back to something that we saw in yesterday's chorale, where instead of 7 going directly to 5, B, D sharp, F sharp, and B, B major, I'm going to use an arrow here so I don't have to fit everything in. We have C, E, E, and A, which is A minor over C, or 4/6. So it turns this C going down to B here in sort of a Phrygian half cadence fashion. Instead of 7 going to 5, we have this injection here that splits the 2 dominant functioning chords, and I feel like there's intention to that, which is really interesting, because I don't think I've encountered a Phrygian half cadence where we have a 7 chord going to 5. So it makes sense that we have 4/6 going to 5 somewhere in the texture. Pretty neat. Okay, moving ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, and I believe we modulate straight away. We have E, E, B, and G, that's E minor, but we have a very interesting chord here, at least I think it's interesting. I might be overthinking it, but this is where I do believe we go to the key of G major. It is now our 6th chord, but we also have C sharp going on here. And when we see C sharp, we're thinking that we're either in E melodic minor land, or we're tonicizing D. And in this case, we're tonicizing D, and it would be unusual to do so in the context of E minor, but in the context of G major, I think this 6 chord has two identities that are made different from one another based on this whole step that's happening here in the alto. So I do think E minor is the gateway between the two keys, but I think also this chord is functioning like C sharp diminished over E, C sharp, E, E, and G, which would be 7, 6 of 5. So the difference between E minor and C sharp diminished is B versus C sharp. So it's interesting that we have 6 going to 5 here, but we also could look at this chord as 7, 6 of 5. And I think it's just one of those chords where I don't really feel like a progression is happening because only one voice is moving, but that one voice can impact what the quality and what the root of the chord is. But regardless, we do go to D major, D, A, D, and F sharp. That's our 5 chord, passing 7th in the bass. And then we have B, D, D, and G. That's our tonic triad, G major in first inversion. We then have A, C, E, and A. We might be tempted to call this a 2 chord, but I think this E is an accented non-chord tone, and this F sharp is actually our chord tone, making this a 7/6 chord. And then if you've seen this progression in the past, you probably know what's going to be on the other side. It's going to be G major in root position, G, D, G, and B. 1, 6, 7, 6, 1. Totally normal progression, very common in Bach's chorales. We then get D, D, G, and A, this G being a 4/3 suspension in the alto over the bass. We know that a 5 chord is being implied, but even on top of that, a 5/7 chord, because by the time the F sharp gets introduced, we have C natural here, making it 5/7 by the time the resolution occurs. And then we get a deceptive progression here. 5/7 goes to not G major, but E minor, E, B, E, and G. That's our 6 chord. And then we get C, C, E, and G with a passing tone in the alto. C major is our 4 chord in the key of G major. And then we get taken kind of to an interesting cadential formula here, not because of the Roman numerals, but because of their orientation. A, C, C, and G with this delayed passing 7th here is like an incomplete A minor 7 chord. So we have this series of descending thirds here, 6 going to 4, 4 going to 2, and 2 is typically inverted here. We typically have the C in the bass, but Bach is really prolonging the predominance until we get the one that is going to actually function as our predominant. And then we go to D major, D, A, D, and F sharp. That's our 5 chord. And then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G, tonic triad in root position. Okay, so looking to our next phrase, we have a half cadence at the end of it in the key of E minor. So we're looking for a point at which we modulate back to the key of E minor, and I think we modulate about halfway through the phrase. So we start off with D major, D, D, F sharp, and A. That's a 5 chord. And then we have G major, G, D, G, and B, which is our tonic triad again. Passing 7th in the bass here before we get E, E, G, and B. That's E minor, which is our 6 chord. And coincidentally, I do believe this is also our tonic in the key of E minor with a passing 7th in the tenor as well. We then have E, C, F sharp, and A. And I think there are 2 ways to interpret this chord. I think my primary analysis is going to be 2/4-2, F sharp minor 7 flat 5 over E. But I think if you look at this E as our chord tone, you can analyze it as 4/6/4. But the reason why I think this is a 2/4-2 chord, because on the other side of it, we have a 5 chord, and it's in first inversion. A 4/2 chord wants to resolve to a triad in first inversion. D sharp, B, F sharp, and A, which is B7 over D sharp. That's 5/6/5. And then we go to B, B, D sharp, and A, which would be taking the chord and putting it in root position without the 5th. So we're getting rid of the F sharp in the alto and replacing it with the D sharp, while the D sharp in the bass is getting replaced with a B. Moving ahead, we have E, B, E, and G. That's our tonic triad, E minor. Neighbor tone here in the alto before we get G, B, E, and G. E minor in first inversion. We're seeing something very similar to the first phrase here in terms of the harmonies at the bass line. And then we get E minor in root position again, E, B, E, and G. So we could just change the figured bass again before we cadence on B major with this 4/3 suspension in the alto, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp, which is a 5 chord in root position. Looking ahead, we have a short complementary phrase where we follow up this half cadence with an authentic cadence in the key of E minor, more specifically a perfect authentic cadence. After our 5 chord, we get C, G, E, and E. So a deceptive progression here. This is C major, which is 6 in the key of E minor. We then have A, C, and F sharp. That's 2, 6, F sharp diminished over A. We know that Bach likes 2, 6, 5 chords and 2, 6 chords in cadential situations. We then have B, F sharp, B, and D sharp. That's our 5 chord, B major. And then we cadence on E minor, E, G, B, and E. Tonic triad, root position. Back to another longer phrase. We end in a half cadence similar to this one right here at measure 13. Half cadence in the key of E minor. I think you could analyze this entire phrase in E minor, but to me this C sharp going to D, just like we saw earlier, reminded me too much of G major for me just to let it stay in the key of E minor in this context. It really does sound like we're in G major for a sizable portion of this phrase. So I think we do have a mid-phrase modulation that then turns back around to E minor on the other end of the phrase. So we start off with E minor, E, G, B, and E. No need to reanalyze. However, in the key of G major, this is also our 6 chord. And then interestingly, we get the E minor right up against the C sharp, which we saw earlier as well. C sharp, G, E, and A. This is A7 over C sharp, which is 5, 6, 5 of 5, because C sharp, or sorry, A is the dominant of D, and D is our 5 chord in the key of G major. And that's where we resolve. D, F sharp, D, and A are dominant. Passing 7th in the bass. Then we get B, F sharp, C, and A. I think this B is an accented non-chord tone, and instead we have A, F sharp, C, and A. Another one of these interesting chord progressions where we have two dominants against one another. Unfortunately, in this case, or why do I say unfortunately like it's a bad thing? Unlike is what I meant to say. Unlike in this case here where we had the two dominants separated by this little brief passing 4 chord here, this 5 and this 7 chord don't have material that separate them. So sometimes we see 5 and 7 next to one another. It's less of a progression going on here and more of a prolongation of the desire to want to resolve, and that's exactly what we get on the next beat, G, G, D, and B, which is our tonic triad, G major. And afterwards we get G, B, E, and B, which is E minor in first inversion. So a little bit of deception going on here, leaping up in the bass and seeing the majority of the chord still intact, but then we get this E changes the chord very slightly. That's kind of the effect that a third space progression has when the chords are a third apart, like 5 going to 7 or 1 going to 6. The chords are more similar than they are different, so it's less of a progression going on and more of like a prolongation that keeps the majority of the tones in common with one another. But regardless, 6, 6 is also 1, 6 in the key of E minor. At least this is how I've analyzed it. You could analyze this whole phrase in E minor if you wanted to. I'm pretty convinced we go to G major though with this mid-phrase modulation. Bach does that from time to time. Passing tone in the bass, E, B, F sharp, and B. I think similar to the last measure, we have an accented non-chord tone here. Actually, the bass is doing very similar things, where we have this figure where the inner eighth notes in this set of 4 eighth notes here are non-chord tones. It's D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, which is 5, 6, B major over D sharp, and that resolves where we would expect E, B, G, and F sharp. This F sharp's a 9/8 suspension over the bass, but still our tonics being implied. This E here is the actual resolution, E, B, E, and G. This D sharp's a neighbor tone. This F sharp is a passing tone. And then we get B, sorry, let me read correctly, G, B, E, and G, which is just taking our tonic triad and putting it in first inversion. Another passing tone in the bass before we cadence on in a very similar fashion to what we saw earlier, B major with this 4-3 suspension in the alto, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp. Closing in on our last phrase, we do not end in the key of B minor. This is actually a half cadence in the key of E minor, and it's a fairly straightforward phrase. We have E, G, B, and E. It's our tonic triad, E minor, passing tone in the melody, E, B, E, and G. Another tonic triad, no need to reanalyze, passing tone in the melody again. D sharp, B, F sharp, and B. That's B major over D sharp. We've seen one going to 5-6 pretty frequently in this chorale. We also have a passing seventh in the tenor before we get E, G, E, and B. It's another tonic triad, E minor, passing seventh in the bass, passing tone in the tenor before we get C, E, E, and B. An interesting chord here, this is what I analyze as C major 7. That's incomplete. We don't have a fifth in this chord, but that's totally okay, because the fifth in a major or minor triad is not integral to its identity, because both major and minor triads share that perfect fifth. It's the third that tells us the quality. This B is a chord tone actually, because it's a major 7 chord. This G is a chord tone, even though it's not on the beat, it fills out the chord. And this D sharp here kind of gives us this G augmented triad vibe here, G, B, B, and D sharp. So that might be going on here, if anything, for a very brief moment, but I don't really think it contributes too much to the chord progression, as this is happening during a cadence, and as we know, Bach gets very contrapuntal in his cadences, proportionately to the rest of the chorale, so take the chords that you see in a cadential situation with a grain of salt. After our 6th chord, and why I think this is a 6th chord in the first place, we get 2, C sharp, E, C natural, E, F sharp, and A. We could make the argument that this is a 2-4-3 chord, but in a similar fashion to the chord we saw earlier, this 7-4-2 chord, I don't think actually a 2-4-3 chord is happening here. I think this is actually 4-6. Even though 7 is preceding it, what I think kind of takes precedence over the fact that 6 wants to go to 2 via the cycle of falling fifths is the fact that 4-6 is a much more likely candidate to resolve to a 5 chord and a half cadence, or more specifically a Phrygian half cadence that involves this half step motion in the bass. It's not uncommon to see 2-4-3 chords and 4-6 chords juxtaposed with one another, because the only difference between the two of them is this whole step. So I think this is a 4-6 chord. It is being substituted for 2 in this context, but Phrygian half cadences, I feel like 4-6 going to 5 makes more sense. And with that being the case, maybe 3 is something that's going on here, because I feel like 3 going to 4 is generally a more common chord progression than 6 going to 4, or they happen in and around the same amount of times. It's relatively uncommon, all things considered. But with that being said, that's today's analysis. Lots of things to talk about. We have a minor dominant chord here. Sorry, I was trying to find it, which is interesting, especially when it gets its own accented, part of the chord progression, in the sense that it's on the harmonic rhythm. This thing right here where we're tonicizing the secondary leading tone, which is, we're tonicizing with a secondary leading tone here as a means of modulating to a key. I think that that's pretty interesting as well, where the chord's identity morphs because one voice changes. This possible augmented chord going on here is pretty fascinating as well. The chord has a mid-phrase modulation, that's pretty interesting as well. And maybe the most surface level fascinating thing about this chorale is that we do not end on an authentic cadence. It's very uncommon for us to not end on an authentic cadence, so here we are ending on one. But other than that, those are my notes on the chorale from a macro perspective. And that's going to conclude my analysis. So if you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Feel free to hit the notification icon so you can be notified of my daily upload. And feel free to like the video if you enjoyed the content. It means that my video will be seen by more people, and that means there's going to be more discussion about theory and analysis, and I love that sort of thing. So with all that being said, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.